This is the second and final lecture on vocalization in birds. In the first lecture, we talked about the different types of vocalizations, how vocalizations are made, and this lecture is going to start off talking about how birds develop their vocalizations. So there are two ways that you could have your song develop. One is have it be heritable or genetic based, where it's simply instinctual and you don't have to learn it. But some birds, actually the majority of birds, since this is the primary way that Aucine passerines do it, is they have to learn their song. So that is the case for Aucine passerines, the songbirds, and that's why they're called the songbirds. But it's also true of parrots and hummingbirds. Hummingbirds don't have the most complex vocalizations, but what they have, they learn. So in the process of learning something, you have to have someone that model it for you, or a tutor. And white-crowned sparrows have been studied to demonstrate that if they're not exposed to a tutor, they don't develop the correct song. So they have to have a tutor to demonstrate that for them. So here is a colored sonogram that shows what one sparrow sounded like when it grew up in isolation, and this is what the typical white-crowned sparrow sounds like. So that's a normal white-crowned sparrow song. Very complex. And compare it to that one. That's the one that grew up in isolation. A very simple, incomplete song. So what are the processes that birds have to undergo to learn their song? So we break it up into two key phases separated by a silent period. So the first phase is called the sensory acquisition phase, or the learning phase. And this is when a model or a tutor is most important. And it's shown here in this top right box. And so they have to have some innate auditory template, so they have some basic neurological ability to listen. But the physiological factors include a hormonal sensitive period, and then the auditory experience here is the song model. Put all that together and we have the template that is used to basically build the song. So at that point the auditory template is acquired, and then most birds go through what is called a silent period. And this is usually in between the end of the last breeding season and the next breeding season, so the non-breeding winter season. And so this is the part where the bird has retained this template, but it's not singing. The beginning of the next phase is called the sensory motor phase, and this is when the birds are getting ramped up for breeding, and so their testosterone for the males is increasing the size of their testes, but it's also affecting their behavior, including vocalizations. And the birds start taking that template that they heard earlier and practicing, and they develop what's called a sub-song or a plastic song. It's basically not very good, and it can be compared to like an infant human that's babbling. So they're just babbling, trying to pick up what the template is, matching it to what they're hearing themselves to produce, and so there's this feedback that's produced in the plastic song. And that ends up forming the matched song when it gets close to the template. And at that point, in most species, we have what is called song crystallization. So at this point, having this hearing feedback is crucial. If you don't have that in birds, then they never develop song crystallization, and they have an imperfect song. So here's an example of a practice song, this sub-song that goes through the babbling phase, and then comparing it to an adult song in a Buick's wren. So this is a wren that we have closer in West Texas. They occasionally show up in East Texas, but not very regularly. You have to go farther west to see them. So I'm going to play the adult song first so that you can hear what a nice, crisp version of that is. So nice crisp notes associated with that. And by just even looking at this colored spectrogram, sonogram here, you can see that there's a lot of noisiness in this situation for the young bird. So it's going to sound much more harsh. Just sounds much more raspy. So that's the situation with most Aucenes, but there is a basic song that is innate in some Aucenes. So there is a heritable basis to the basic song in some species, like the gray catbird, which we'll be seeing here in East Texas soon. But the gray catbird can still learn other songs, and it actually improves its own basic song by listening to others. So it goes in kind of this modified learning phase. Catbirds are in the Mimicry, and so they're within this group that shows a lot of mimicry. When we get into most of the sub-Aucenes, like these willow and alders flycatchers, it's clearly an innate situation here. They can develop their normal songs even if they're raised in isolation. And we'll talk about the importance of the invariability of this, staying very consistent within the species and really not even showing a lot of geographic variation. This is really important for helping to identify these species. These birds are what are called, they're in the genus Impidnax flycatchers, and impids, as they're oftentimes referred to, are notoriously difficult to identify visually, and really you have to hear them sing to be confident in your identification. We've been seeing eastern phoebes in the lab, and eastern phoebes, unlike the white-crowned sparrow I mentioned earlier, can develop normal songs if they're deaf. So they don't require singing and hearing that song to go through kind of a practice phase. They just know what their song is right away and can produce it. But again, those are sub-Aucenes. Now that's not to say that there are not some sub-Aucenes that have some flexibility in their song. So this is a three-wattled bellbird. This is a neotropical species that produces these amazingly loud vocalizations. We'll see later when we talk about life history in birds that birds in the tropics tend to live longer than birds in the Nearctic region. And that's true of the three-wattled bellbird. What has been shown in this species is that they have these changes year to year. So it's almost like there are different trends that or styles that occur in their song. And all of the individuals and populations tend to match one another year to year. And this is a song of the three-wattled bellbird. That's also a really good example of a bird that uses kind of a vocalization that focuses on the lower frequencies, and that works really well in the dense vegetation associated with a tropical environment. Another bird you might look up sometime and play the vocalization is a screaming Piha. Screaming Pihas are also incredibly loud tropical species. Some of the loudest birds recorded. Another indication that some birds have a heritable basis associated with their song development is the fact that if you hybridize two different species that have different songs, you can develop an intermediate song. And this has been shown in some species of doves and quail. So getting into talking about non-passerines. Roosters, it's the same situation. So in galliforms, they can develop normal songs even if deaf, so similar to what I said with the eastern phoebe. But again, now we're talking about non-passerines. But not all non-passerines have these innate songs. So parrots and hummingbirds do learn and modify their songs as they age. They don't tend to show as much song crystallization. Year to year, you'll see imitation of neighbors' song is common. This is seen in hummingbirds. Now let's move to talking about how in some species you can show what are called regional dialects. Just like in the human language, in English in the United States, you can tell someone from Chicago versus New York, versus Alabama versus West Texas. So this is also true in birds. So all of the figures on the right show different versions of a white-crowned sparrow song. How these develop is as individuals in an area are listening to a tutor, different areas may have different individuals that serve as the models that train the local population. And if these become isolated, then very regionally specific dialects can develop, as I'll show you in the next slide. But first, let me play you just some of the variation. You can clearly see there's variation in these white-crowned sparrow songs, but let's play some of it. So here's from an eastern population. Now it's contrasted to this one. Tell a lot buzzier here. So very different. It's the same species, but this is in the Puget Sound area. So just some examples to show you just how variable you can have songs develop into different dialects within the same species. So again, how could these localized dialects form? Well, here's a diagram that kind of models some of this behavior potentially. So if we had a broad range of interconnected white-crowned sparrows, but there was habitat alteration like a large-scale fire that destroyed habitat where it couldn't be occupied for a period of time until the next breeding season, and grassy patches started popping up with appropriate habitat for white-crowned sparrows, but they were very isolated from each other. So we have founder events of founders invading these habitats, setting up new populations, and that could lead to the formation of very habitat-specific dialects, such that once the populations merge back together and form boundaries, they may not even interbreed with each other, and this may be a very early stage of speciation. Here's another example of regional dialects. So marsh wrens have two basic dialects that splits continentally. There's an eastern and a western song. Here's the eastern song, something we would have here. This is oftentimes referred to as like a sewing machine. Now let's contrast that to the western one. So you can hear them going both. That's the western, you can hear the eastern continuing. Now in some species, different populations sing different songs, like in this Blythe reed warbler, but they do share song elements across the entire species range. They simply rearrange these song elements in unique ways. Now in many birds we're finding that we see dialect matching, such that as individuals enter a neighborhood, they begin to copy each other's song. So a juvenile that may have heard a model from its neighborhood may use that in part as a template for developing its song, but will also listening to neighbors in the new territory area that it is trying to establish and use that as part of the song crystallization process. And so you can see some of the variation in indigo buntings here. And you can clearly see that the top two are in the same territorial neighborhood. So here's territory A, here's territory B. Very similar songs, very different from a stranger from a different neighborhood. So listen to this one and we'll compare it to the next one. Okay, now compare it to a neighbor. Cardinal in the background. So very similar, and see how different it is from this one from another neighborhood. Very, very different. Song sparrows do a similar thing. They show convergent to their neighbor's song. And why would indigo buntings and song sparrows do this? Well, we talked earlier about the deer-enemy cooperation theory, and the idea is that once neighbors set up the territorial boundaries and know the rules with their neighbors, so that Bob and John and Chuck understand where the territorial boundaries are, it all helps them. So it reduces the fact that they have to fight over this constant territoriality. And we talked about how they can have individual variation to recognize each other, but they also have kind of like this group signal, kind of like a secret code that says, yeah, I belong in this neighborhood. And that is the convergence to having some similar song characteristics. And the songs are not identical because, again, they have to have that individual recognition. But you can see that here we have three individuals that do share some elements that are very similar. In some species, like marsh wrens, they show what's called matched countersinging, where territorial neighbors will copy each other's song. In some regards, this might be a test of their quality, like how well you can recreate the same vocalization I can, as a sign of dominance and competence. So a lot of Aucenes do show this regional dialect development, but there are other species that do not show geographic dialects. And that is true of most sub-Aucenes. So again, the sub-Aucenes include things like the Flycatcher. And so here we have an alder flycatcher and a willow flycatcher. And you can see that they clearly have very different songs. And as I mentioned, these Impidnax flycatchers, this is crucial for us to be able to identify an individual two species. And in fact, this can actually be a tool to help identify what we call cryptic species. Birds that look similar to each other, but actually represent two different breeding groups or two different species. And if they have clearly different songs that are very consistent between the groups, that is clear indication that you're dealing with two species. Let's move on and talk about repertoire size. In something like a white-throated sparrow, an individual will just have one song basically, while other species, like this chaffinch shown here, can have, say, three or more songs. And then we get to some of the more extremes, like some of the wrens can have hundreds of songs, and including some of the mimics can have hundreds of songs. Some examples of mimics include nightingales, which are shown here on the top, and the brown thrasher. We've been hearing and seeing brown thrashers in labs here. So here's a nightingale vocalization. So it might remind you somewhat of a northern mockingbird, kind of similar in their complexity. But this is a European species. Now let's contrast that with a brown thrasher. Brown thrashers also have lots of songs, but what you'll see about the brown thrasher, and this is one of the ways that you can use it to distinguish between a northern mockingbird and a brown thrasher, mockingbirds tend to be more, they'll take a phrase and they'll go with it and sing it many, many times. Brown thrashers are a little more impatient, and they tend to do their little phrases in doubles or singles. So you see how many things are kind of doubled there. There's also a tone difference that you might learn to listen to between brown thrashers and mockingbirds. Brown thrashers tend to be a little more kind of raspy. So why have large repertoires? Well, we briefly touched on this when we talked about the function of song in the last lecture. It could be linked to male quality, but studies have shown some inconsistent results with this, with regard to dominance, so that it's not always the case that the male with the largest repertoire is the most dominant, or is the one that tends to sway female choice the most. There's a little bit of variation there, but in some studies it has been linked to age, so that older males learn more song, and just the fact that a male can live to be older is an honest demonstration that he is of high quality, and so that may lead to an increased mate choice. So it may be important in some cases, but maybe not in others. To talk a little bit more about mimicry, it's seen in about 20% of passerines. It's very extensive in some groups, so for example the Mimicry, which includes the great catbird, the northern mockingbird, and the brown thrasher. The Sternidae, the European starlings, are also very good mimics. In fact, I had a friend that had a starling as a pet, and it sounded just like him. The bird pictured here on the bottom right is a superb lyrebird, and they are incredible mimics. Maybe I think my favorite. And also close related bowerbirds are very good mimics. There's a BBC special called The Life of Birds, and if you look up lyrebird and chainsaw, it can show you just some really amazing vocalizations. You might recognize one coming up. It does a kookaburra. Right there. And here's the one I was talking about where they show some just amazing imitation of cameras and even a chainsaw in this case. So they mimic all kinds of sounds. I'm going to try to play it for you, but sometimes when I try to include bits like this, I get copyright issues. So we'll see. If it doesn't end up in the video, then just please go to this link and listen to it yourself.
What bird has the most elaborate, the most complex, and the most beautiful song in the world? Well, I guess there are lots of contenders, but this bird must be one of them. The superb lyrebird of southern Australia.
He clears a space in the forest to serve as his concert platform. To persuade females to come close and admire his plumes, he sings the most complex song he can manage, and he does that by copying the songs of all the other birds he hears around him, such as the kookaburra. It's a very convincing impersonation. Even the original is fooled. He can imitate the calls of at least 20 different species. He also, in his attempt to outsing his rivals, incorporates other sounds that he hears in the forest. That was a camera shutter. And again. And now a camera with a motor drive. And that's a car alarm. And now the sounds of foresters and their chainsaws working nearby.
So again, what is the function of mimicry? Probably just increase the repertoire size, right? So again, associated with mate choice, so that as you get older, you learn more songs, and so females can pick older males that have proven themselves. Now, this has been demonstrated with European starlings. But in other cases, it's the case that females want to make sure that they mate with males that winter in the same place that they do. And so in some cases, in marsh warblers, for example, they can all breed together in southern Europe, but they winter in different places in Africa. And they may have co-adapted gene complexes that make it where they would be better off making sure they mate with an individual that winters in the same place that they do, so that their offspring have the right genes for wintering in that area. And so the males actually incorporate some of the songs of the birds from their wintering range to convince females that that's where they're from. Now in lab, we've been hearing mimicry of red-shouldered hawks by blue jays, and there are a variety of proposed functions of this. Perhaps it is a way for birds, if they're going after some food in competition with another bird, to cause it to fright away, and so they get access to that resource and there's less competition. Perhaps it's a way of simply increasing the repertoire. It's just something that they can repeat, and again may be important in mate choice. We really just don't know what the function of this is. So now I want to talk a little bit about the dawn chorus. The dawn chorus is this phenomenon in which we see lots of birds suddenly singing very intensively on top of each other, so that there's this cacophony of sound right at sunrise. So here's an example of a dawn chorus in a marshland habitat. Well, there are certain patterns associated with it. One is that birds with larger eyes and probably better vision at low light levels tend to sing first, so that it may be a sign of just ability to become active. Or birds that are closer to the forest edge, again, that get more light earlier, tend to sing first. Another pattern associated with the dawn chorus is that some species will sing the same song throughout the day and in the dawn chorus, but they just do it faster. Other species can sing songs that are of different complexities. So a good example of the former here, the same song just faster, chipping sparrows. Chipping sparrows have this kind of insect-like vocalization, but it's much faster in the dawn chorus. Same thing with pine warblers. Eastern wood peewees, however, have relatively simple daytime songs, but they add some complexity associated with their dawn song. So here's an eastern wood peewee with the dawn song, and it's more complex. Okay, let's contrast that to the simpler song that they sing during the day, where they really are kind of saying their word. They're going, pee-wee, pee-you. So it's almost like birds during the dawn chorus are more excited and they're putting more energy into their vocalizations in many cases. So again, why do this? Why does the dawn chorus exist? Well, there are a couple of hypotheses. One, the idea is that it's just a more efficient time to communicate because wind tends to be lower in the morning. So it's a more efficient way of attracting mates and defending territories. Another is that it may simply be the best time to recruit females. Many of these Aucine passerines are nocturnal migrants, and females may be arriving during the night into a territory that males have already established. And by singing first, you might be able to get the first crack at the new arriving females. The other is it's just the first time to check to see who made it through the night, who didn't die to predation or died from other reasons, to see if the territories are still stable and occupied by the same individuals. The last hypothesis that has been put forth is that they're doing it just because it's too cold to do anything else. So while they might want to forage, it's just too cold to do that, so they might as well sing. Now, I don't see that being a good explanation in its own right, because why would you do something that's so energetically expensive, especially when you're at your lowest energy reserve level, unless there is also some benefit from one of the hypotheses listed above. Again, birds also make non-vocal sounds. We covered this a little bit. So drumming and woodpeckers, this broad range, broad spectrum vocalizations. But some birds, like palm cockadoos, don't use their bill to drum. They do drumming using literally a drumstick. And males will do this to attract females to a cavity. And perhaps what they're doing is they're indicating the resonance associated with that cavity and some of the qualities of that cavity.
Maybe it's because palm cockatoos live so long that they have time to learn so much. But it's a rare thing anywhere in the animal world to see a tool being used quite this deliberately.
I think it's very likely that the female watches these drumming displays and can tell something about either the male or the nest tree at which he's performing. You know, there's something that she's picking up in the way that the drumming sound resonates inside the hollow. We don't really know, but I mean, she watches very intently.
The choosy males will try 2 or 3 different drumsticks before they settle on one that they really like.
When they actually perform the drumming display at the nest, it does seem to have a rhythm. But when he's finished with it, he'll often sit at the edge of the hollow and splinter up the stick and add it to the nesting platform that's inside the hollow.
And then when we talked about feathers, we talked about some of the function of feathers in producing sound. Others examples of non-vocal sounds, like seen in American woodcocks using their primaries, and Wilson snipe producing the non-vocal sounds associated with their rectrices. Sometimes birds will use both visual displays and vocal displays in their territorial and mating displays. That's the case of the Eurasian skylark, shown here. And hummingbirds do some of the same things. So hummingbirds will do these amazing visual displays. This is a calliope hummingbird. You can see the male down here in the lower left, and it's putting out these bright covert feathers on its chest that have this amazing kind of purplish red color, showing that to a female. So there's the visual display, but they also do these flights, these U-shaped flights just above a female to get her attention. And in the process of doing that, they produce these vibration wing buzzing noises in addition to their vocalizations. All right, and that is the last bit of information on vocalization in birds.